climate is finally taking center stage, at least in the Democratic presidential race. This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
You don't get to ruin the air for everyone else, the water for everyone else, the soil for everyone else. We don't just to help giant corporations.
You know, if you believe that God is watching as poison is being belched into the air of creation and people are being harmed by it, countries are at risk of vanishing, what do you suppose God thinks of that?
So let me be very clear. The coal miners in this country, the men and women who work on the oil rigs, they are not my enemy. What is my enemy is climate change.
Climate change got little attention during the 2016 presidential debates, but the field of Democratic candidates recently took to the stage in New York for a 7-hour-long CNN town hall about what the network called the climate crisis. Each of the 10 candidates had about a half hour to lay out their plan to deal with climate change. Here to talk about what they said and what is in their plans is Leah Stokes. She's an assistant professor of environmental politics at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And she joins me now. Leah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Leah, I guess I have to ask, did you watch all 7 hours of this thing?
Yes, I did. I was close to missing the beginning because I dropped my cell phone in the woods, funny enough. But I got there when Julian Castro took the stage, and I stayed until Cory Booker left. So I watched every minute.
So we'll get into the details in a minute because I know you've been following this issue very closely. But what were your big takeaways from watching it?
I think it was amazing, of course, for CNN to devote 7 hours to this. They get huge kudos in my book. And of course, that is a result of the organizing from Sunrise Movement. They have completely transformed the conversation around climate policy. The Green New Deal is really center stage during the Democratic primary. It's amazing. So I think that is the biggest takeaway, that finally, for those of us who have been working on this for a decade or more, the crisis that we all see unfolding is starting to find its way into the center of the Democratic Party, which is where it needs to be.
So with this town hall, there were a lot of questions from the moderators geared towards making the candidates accountable for past decisions that, those in the climate movement would deem questionable. There were questions about Julian Castro's support for natural gas.
As mayor of San Antonio, you welcome the fracking boom. Why should we trust you as president to transition our economy to renewables, given your past middle ground approach?
Joe Biden was asked about holding a fundraiser with a Wall Street guy who has a big stake in a fossil fuel company.
How can we trust you to hold these corporations and executives accountable for their crimes against humanity when we know that tomorrow you are holding a high-dollar fundraiser hosted by Andrew Goldman, a fossil fuel executive?
He's not a fossil fuel executive, I'm told.
Part of talking about climate change is also talking about the discourse around it and how it's framed. How did you think CNN did in this format?
Well, I think the best thing that CNN did was that they gave the microphone to a diverse set of activists and students and scientists and people of all walks of life. And those were the best moments in the 7 hours, for sure.
Everyone is affected by climate change, but people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by our Earth's changing climate. How do you plan to support already at-risk and marginalized people?
Your platform relies heavily on geoengineering and locally based efforts rather than aggressive federal emissions policies. Geoengineering poses major risks.
Moving towards a green economy for all is critical for our planet. As we make the transition from dirty diesel and coal, our industry workers, many of whom voted for Donald Trump in the last election.
Older generations have continued to fail our generation by repeatedly choosing money and power over our lives and our futures. So how can we trust you to put us, the future, over the wants of large corporations and wealthy individuals?
So I think that was really smart what they did, and they curated those questions very well. They spread a broad net and asked people to submit ideas, and I think they did a good job as a result of tailoring the questions to each candidate and to each candidate's plans. So we did, for example, see that PhD student ask a very pointed question to Joe Biden about, the history of denial in the fossil fuel companies. And he ended it with an impromptu question about the fundraiser that Joe Biden was going to go to. And I will say that even though Joe Biden was quite defensive about that on stage and Anderson Cooper did an excellent job of pushing him on it, my understanding is that Joe Biden still went to that fundraiser.
So what Andrew is saying is, if you're going to a fundraiser that's given in part by this guy who has a company that is pulling up natural gas, are you the right guy to go after these?
Well, I didn't realize he does that. I was told if you look at the SEC filings, he's not listed as one of those executives. That's what we look at, the SEC filings. Who are those executives? I've kept that pledge, period.
So are you going to look at that fundraiser tomorrow night?
I'm going to look at what you just told me and find out if that's accurate, yes.
Okay. I think it's pretty accurate. Aaron?
I think there was accountability trying to be put on these candidates, and Joe Biden still went to the fossil fuel fundraiser, so there you go. CNN's own questions tended to be more gotcha and focused on things that aren't really the lion's share of the problem, nor really the purview of federal government policy.
But do you think that the government should be in the business of telling you what kind of light bulb you can have?
Oh, come on, give me a break.
Is that a yes?
No, look.
I'm curious. I want to talk a little bit more about, because I feel like this is just a pattern that we're going to hear a lot of, is if anybody has a plan to deal with climate change, the question immediately goes to, are you going to steal cheeseburgers out of the hands of senior citizens who are also drinking a Pepsi with a plastic straw?
You're a vegan, and when you've talked about being a vegan in the past, and I want to quote you here, let me get it right. You said that you don't want to preach to anybody about their diets. So my question is, your administration wouldn't have any programs to encourage healthy diets that would also combat climate change?
Oh my gosh. So let's go right at this, because I hear about it all the time. Booker wants to take away your hamburger. That is the kind of lies and fear-mongering that they spread.
CNN's been criticized for this, sort of fixating on cheeseburgers, and Elizabeth Warren had the line in her talk about how this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry wants us to be talking about, and not about sort of their end of the bargain.
But understand, this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry hopes we're all talking about. That's what they want us to talk about. They want to be able to stir up a lot of controversy around your light bulbs, around your straws, and around your cheeseburgers. When 70% of the pollution, of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from 3 industries, and we can set our targets and say by 2028, 2030, and 2035, no more. Think about that.
But I guess at the core, a lot of what I think about climate change when I look at the scale of the problem is, it is going to require like people to do things differently. And sugarcoating that doesn't seem like a good long-term solution. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how we should be talking about these behavioral changes that, let's face it, are probably going to have to happen if we're going to deal with this crisis?
Well, I would first start by saying I agree with you. Elizabeth Warren did a masterful job fielding that question. What we're talking about here is a long-term debate in the environmental community about the balance between individual behavior change versus government and structural change. And I will say that I myself got my start in research in the environmental field 15 years ago as an environmental psychology student. I was studying how to get people to save energy. So, I ran a campaign. I got people to save 12% energy. It was successful. But from that experience, what I learned is that all I managed to do was to get some people to save 12% of energy, and that didn't structurally change the system. And the fact is that we people, individuals within the system, are responding to the signals that the government sends, that the market sends. We're responding to the options available to us. Nobody can just unilaterally choose to live in a low carbon society. So yes, it's important for people, if they want to make better choices about their carbon footprint or their lifestyle choices. But purity is not the goal, because even if you live like Greta Thunberg, who I am a huge fan of, and I think she's wonderful, but even if you do that, the most important thing that she is doing is the political work that she is doing to change the system. And that is really fundamentally what government policy is about and what the Democratic primary needs to be about. So I think actually all the candidates uniformly did a good job of pushing back against that. Actually, the one exception being Julian Castro, who in fairness was the first of the night, so he didn't get to see everybody else get the exact same question. So he struggled with it a bit more. But I think that overall this fixation on individual behavior change is not helpful to the broader structural change that will actually unlock huge differences in our carbon emissions in the future.
So let's get to some of the candidates and what they had to say. How would you sort of describe this field from sort of those with more cautious plans, less ambitious, to those with more ambitious plans? And maybe we'll go from there.
In terms of the scale of the climate crisis, we have to move as quickly as possible because we have lost at least 4 decades to a denial campaign funded by the fossil fuel industry. So, they have blocked progress at the federal level. States and cities have tried to fill that gap, but they can't really do it. The fact is that the hour is running short and we must move quickly. So I don't really think of it as moderate versus progressive myself. I think of it, is this on the scale of the crisis versus is this insufficient to maintaining a stable climate? And so what we know from peer-reviewed research is that we cannot build any new fossil fuel infrastructure and stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. So if that's your goal, to stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target, it means that the positions of Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar are not tenable because they have continued to say that we will, support natural gas infrastructure in the United States. And in defense of both of those candidates, I think they say that in good faith, that they say, look, this is the world we live in. We have natural gas. We can't just shut down the industry tomorrow. And that's true and fair. And Julian Castro fits a little bit in that camp too, although he, I think, is a bit more towards a phase out. But actually, if we want to have climate stability, we have to say that that is not a viable position. So then we have other candidates who are more willing to do the hard work of keeping fossil fuels in the ground. That's not going to be a simple thing to do. That's fundamentally about destroying assets of wealthy, powerful people in society. The Koch industry brothers, for example. So many other candidates have plans that, for example, say that we're going to ban fracking. That's Bernie Sanders' position, or we're going to phase it out. That's Elizabeth Warren's position. I will say one place of pretty much unanimous support, and it's great that this is a unanimous position, is they're going to end the leases of public lands for fossil fuel development. And the nice thing is that's actually what a president can do. So sometimes we see in these climate plans sort of huge promises. That would probably be most in Bernie Sanders' plan, where he says he will spend $16 trillion on this. And there are, of course, questions of how is he going to get Congress to approve that much spending, right? And I'm not saying that he shouldn't try or that it's not worth it given the scale of the crisis, but that's a legitimate critique of his approach. But the reality is that we have to be moving a lot faster and spending a lot of money. And we need to be thinking about what are the things that the president can do, and banning development on public lands is something where all the candidates are. So how do we judge which plan is bigger or bolder or more progressive? You can judge that based on the amount of money is in the plan, and many people have adopted that point of view and have said that Bernie Sanders' plan is therefore the best because it's 16 trillion. But the issue is that if you actually dig into the spending categories in that plan, which I have done, not all of them are for a low carbon future. So, for example, there's $150 billion in that plan for broadband access. maybe we want to spend a lot of money on broadband, but it's not clear to me that that decarbonizes the world. There's also about $700 billion for roads, over $2 trillion for electric vehicles, which is great. But again, that doesn't change the density of our cities, which of course is a huge issue when we think about the amount of energy that we're using in society. So to me, it's not enough to just say, this is the most money and therefore it's the best. I think we have to think critically about where is that money going, and is it really going to get us to the low carbon future that we need to be in as fast as possible?
So one of the things about this issue is, any plan from a Democrat is going to have to get sold to the public. So how do you see these candidates in terms of their ability to communicate these policy goals, the extent of the crisis, sort of selling their plan to the public? Who stuck out to you as like, okay, that was they made some good points and I can see people getting won over by them?
I think that Elizabeth Warren was the most positive, upbeat, high energy of the night.
As president, would you be willing to call out capitalism in this way and advocate for the public ownership of our utilities?
Gosh, I'm not sure that that's what gets you to the solution.
She really presented this as an economic opportunity. She made it clear who the enemies are.
It's corruption. It's these giant corporations that keep hiring the PR firms that does that. Everybody has fun with it, right? Gets it all out there. So we don't look at who's still making the big bucks of polluting our earth.
I think that kind of messaging is really smart and positive. And you can see that when people start to grapple with the scale of the climate crisis, sort of on a personal level, they often go to a place of fear and dread. And I think it was very powerful to see her be so positive and to paint a picture for the future.
I think that the best way we go forward here is we open up the opportunities, we open up the possibilities, we invest in the science, we invest in the manufacturing, we invest in the pieces that let us build a future together going forward.
And I've done some research that shows, for example, that emphasizing the benefits of acting, that can really bring more people along with the plan. That includes Republicans.
Am I going to guarantee Jeff Bezos he's not going to be paying more in taxes? No, I won't.
I will also give credit to Bernie Sanders. It's clear that he's very passionate about this subject, that he doesn't want big polluters to be able to continue with impunity. And I think he did connect with many viewers on those issues.
What I will do, and I'm not here to tell you that I think it will happen like this, but I think it's worth the try, that in this extraordinary moment of global crisis, I think we need a president, hopefully Bernie Sanders, that reaches out to the world, to Russia and China and India, Pakistan, all the countries over the world, and say, guess what? Whether you like it or not, we are all in this together. And if you are concerned about the children in your country and future generations, we're going to have to work together. And maybe, just maybe, instead of spending $1.5 trillion every single year on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other, maybe we pool those resources and we work together against our common enemy, which is climate change. So
I also think that Cory Booker drew the short compostable straw of the night because he was last, but he did a great job.
That means every one of my departments, every one of my agencies, every one of my cabinet members, from the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of Agriculture, has to be coming up with an aggressive climate plan. I'm going to use the power of my pen to right away go after the executive orders that Donald Trump did to unravel the things that Obama did. I'm going to make sure that I go further.
He was really smart on a lot of the issues. He, too, seems to care a lot. So I think his communication style was quite good, too. And I will say that I have the impression that Beto O'Rourke also cares enormously about this issue. He seems like he was very influenced by reading David Wallace Wells' book, Uninhabitable Earth.
I want us to respond to this with the urgency that this crisis demands. And I see that, by the way, from so many of the people who are here, so many young people in particular who understand that we don't get a second chance at this. I see that from my own kids, who are going to be
And you can see that he's also been quite influenced by activists, which I think is great that we have a politician from Texas like Beto O'Rourke who was open-minded enough to be moved.
And I want America to come together regardless of Republicans or Democrats or your geography or any other difference. Do not allow that to divide us at this critical, important, defining moment. This is our challenge, and I know that we are up to the test.
I think the same could be said about Julian Castro. You know, he also seems to have his heart in the right place. And he was really grappling with that question about, you know, how do you think about your past behaviors and are you responsible? I could tell that he's taking it very seriously.
Looking back with the challenge that we have, right, with this UN report that says now, I guess it's 11 years that we have left. It was 12 years in 2018 when they released it. I think many of us look back and say, wow, you know, the earlier we could start, the better. So, of course, if I were mayor of San Antonio again, would I approach things a little bit differently? Yeah, perhaps.
You had Kamala Harris as well really give her history as a prosecutor on these issues, and I think that came across really well. For example, were she in charge of the DOJ, I think she'd do a fantastic job of making this a priority. And of course, were she president, I think too, she would bring a lot to the table in terms of understanding the environmental justice elements of the issue, as well as the legal approaches to holding big polluters accountable.
I mean, listen, guys, let's just be really clear. Donald Trump, he's got everybody excited about those crazy tweets. Meanwhile, with this hand, quietly undoing regulations that were built up over years, including incredible stuff that the Obama administration did, and quietly undoing that. So everybody's distracted by the crazy tweet. Meanwhile, completely deregulating industry.
I guess I don't really have a lot of bad words for people. I think people did pretty well, actually. And even somebody like Andrew Yang, who I don't always agree with, you know, he brought a different flavor to the issue, and I think that was valuable. He was willing to talk about technologies like things like geoengineering that other people aren't willing to talk about or don't even really know about. And I think while that's a very dangerous and tricky topic, it is important that we be having these conversations in our democracy. And I think Andrew Yang has added that to the primary for sure.
Geoengineering, I just want us to think very, very big picture of what's happening. You have countries, island countries on the other side of the world that are literally sinking underwater. And we're lifting people, the UN is helping people move. Now, they don't have the capacity to do something dramatic to alter the environment. But imagine a country like China 25 years from now.
I want to talk about some of the differences that some of these candidates had. Like, for instance, on nuclear energy, Bernie is against nuclear energy for, you know, reasons of fears of things like meltdowns and radioactive waste. But, you know, a lot of climate scientists say, whoa, we kind of need nuclear energy for the foreseeable future. What were some of the big differences between some of these candidates as you see them?
Well, I'm happy to unpack the nuclear issue. Somehow I've become a person to talk about this, which is funny because I myself was not pro-nuclear not so many years ago. Basically, what we're talking about with the nuclear issue is it's a complex issue. We have existing plants and we have new plants. So when it comes to existing plants, they supply 20% of the electricity system right now and 55% of the clean, zero carbon electricity that we have. And many of these plants are going to start coming up to the end of their operating life, well, specifically the end of their licenses. And what Bernie Sanders has said is that he would not extend licenses for operating plants. And some people, myself included, feel that that is a problematic position because if the plants are safe, my view is that they should continue to operate. And that is because we only get 10% of our electricity right now from renewable energy sources, excluding hydropower. So that's wind and solar and all that. And that's after about 4 decades of trying to build up that industry. That industry is at a point now where it could start growing really fast. But the fact is, we're only adding to that 10% by less than 1% a year. So we're going to be at like 10.75% next year. So if you really take a 2030 target seriously, which is what is in Bernie Sanders' plan, or you take a 2035 target seriously, which is what is in Elizabeth Warren's plan after she adopted Inslee's plans a couple days ago, you really got to run the numbers. And what we would be talking about if, let's say, we get rid of nuclear, okay? Or no, let's say we keep nuclear. That's easier to do. So we keep the existing fleet. All right, we don't do what Bernie Sanders says. We keep the fleet open. How hard is it going to be to fill the rest of the electricity system with renewables? Well, we need to basically increase the deployment rate for renewables by a factor of 10. They need to be growing around 6 percentage points a year. Okay, so we're at 0.6% and they need to be growing at 6%. And that's partially because if you want to take the entire transportation sector and electrify that, because of course, when cars are driving around, they're belching out carbon dioxide wherever they are, and we got to get rid of that problem. So what we do is we put them on the grid. If you want to do that, then you need to make the grid about 2 times as big as it is right now. Okay? So that means we have to grow the grid by a huge amount. We need to make the electricity system that we have today, which took us about 120 years to build, and we need to do that again in about 10 to 15 years. That is a monumental undertaking, and we should not be tying our hands as we do it. Now, where things get slightly even more complicated is with new nuclear plants. So some candidates like Cory Booker, I believe, Andrew Yang for sure, Pete Buttigieg, they have said, we support new nuclear plants. And specifically, they want to put money into innovation for new second generation technology, whether that's like thorium or fusion or small modular reactors or whatever it is. Okay, maybe that might work. But let's say we build the plants that we have, the technology we have today. Well, we are doing that in a few cases. They are way behind schedule in terms of their construction, and they're way over budget. So they're kind of losers from a pure economic perspective. So probably we're not going to build new nuclear anyway because the economics are not there. And when it comes to new nuclear, the issue, which I think Jigar Shah has made very well this point, is that innovation is a slow process, right? We've been putting money into trying to unlock fusion and next generation nuclear for a long time, and it hasn't come. And given the scale of the crisis that we have before us, the fact that we have already warmed the planet 1 degree Celsius, it's a bit risky to put a lot of money into innovation that may not turn out. So that is my interpretation of what Warren's position is. It is that, look, we're going to keep existing plants open until we can have renewables, but we're not going to put a lot of new money into nuclear, versus other candidates like Biden and Buttigieg and Booker and Yang, they want to put more money into nuclear. And I think that both of those positions are quite reasonable, actually. I do not agree with Bernie Sanders' position because I think it makes it even harder to do a pretty much impossible task. But hopefully that helps me walk you through one of the really big issues that we have in the primary where candidates are disagreeing.
I want to get to another question, but before we do, I just wanted to mention Jigar Shah is a clean energy entrepreneur and kind of an evangelist who has his own podcast called The Energy Gang. There's this other issue that I'm actually, like, no one is really going to notice this, but I think it's actually a fascinating difference between the candidates, which is this idea of that Bernie has of nationalizing the grid. And I think it's so interesting because it really gets at kind of a philosophy of government and power and who should control what and what's the best way to do all this. Bernie wants to nationalize the grid, essentially, in the manner of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a quasi-public electric generation entity, and take it away from the private sector. A lot of places get their energy, electricity at least, from these private utilities. So can you walk us through that aspect of it and, give your thoughts on which plan you think is the best for that?
Yes, I'm very happy to. And it was really funny. I on energy Twitter or climate Twitter, we love to fight each other regularly about the individual behavior change thing versus the structural behavior change. And there was more than enough time to have that fight given the way CNN was constantly bringing up hamburgers. But yet, the biggest debate while we were all watching this and also talking to each other on Twitter was about exactly this issue, the question of governance and public ownership of electricity versus private ownership. And the reason why it became so heated was because as you point out, Bernie Sanders has a pretty clear view in his plan, which is that he wants to use tools like the ones that created the TVA to create lots of public power. And his view is actually that the capital overlays will get paid off and then electricity will just be free. So it's a pretty distinct view. And then when Elizabeth Warren was asked about that during the debate, she said, I'm not sure that public ownership, I'm not sure that that solves the problem. And I said in response, I agree. I am not sure that solves that problem. Why do I think that? And let me assure you, many others in the community disagree with me, and I'm open to changing my mind. But to me, empirics and evidence is what matters. So I have spent the past 10 years about learning a lot about the electric utility industry, and specifically I've been writing a book that will be out in March 2020 called Short Circuiting Policy, and it is about the history of electric utilities going back to the 1920s in the US, and it's specifically about the way that those utilities have resisted clean energy. They've resisted renewable portfolio standards and net metering. Okay, so I definitely think that private utilities are hugely problematic entities. However, the assumption that somehow public utilities will solve the problem it is not shown in the empirical record. So I think there are real questions about whether this solution that Bernie Sanders is proposing is the solution. And what really gets my goat, so to speak, is when people say, well, Elizabeth Warren isn't as good on climate change because she says that she's not sure that public power will solve the problem. Because that is just a true statement that, you know, the empirical record is far more mixed than activists would sometimes suggest. And, I just don't feel that it should be a litmus test, like, for example, somebody's position on fracking should be, or even their position on existing nuclear should be.
Climate activists might be cheering for a lot of these plans. Have you started to think, how will some of this, you know, these policy proposals and these sort of ideas that have come out of the Democratic presidential primary, how will they play more in a general election when you have a very different type of electorate and the candidates typically run more to the center? What do you think about that? And embedded in that question is, like, where is the general population on this issue? Is it becoming more important to them?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something we haven't probably been talking a lot about. When Hickenlooper was still in the race, he would always rail against the Green New Deal, saying it was a loser in the general. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but he was making an argument that we should be thinking farther down the line. Look, there's been a huge fear for a long time in the Democratic Party to even talk about climate change. I have heard a story about a Democratic representative for Congress running in Southern California who wanted to, this is in the last election cycle in 2018, who wanted to talk about climate change as part of his campaign. And his advisors reportedly said, don't do it. And he went and looked up the wonderful resource that the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, as well as my colleagues at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as colleagues at Utah State produce. They have been for many years making these maps that go to every congressional district, every state, so you can figure out if this is a winner or a loser on lots of different issues. And what that representative did, who was running for Congress, is he went to those maps and he went to his advisors and said, look, this is a winning issue. Look at the popular support. So I would again turn to the empirics, which is that a Green New Deal, while it's been attacked by Fox News and the particular branding of the idea are not as popular as it was initially, the content of a Green New Deal and the ideas that these candidates are talking about, that is still really popular. And I have some research that I haven't published yet, but it's under review, which shows that actually packaging climate policy with social policy and economic policy increases support. So I think that the hypothesis that the Green New Deal framers have, that we can build a broader coalition, we can focus more on benefits, I think that's a really smart move, because for so long, climate policy has been about costs. It's been about carbon taxes, right? Without focusing on things like job creation, or maybe giving people a living wage, giving them benefits like healthcare. So that is what the Green New Deal is about. And I think it's quite popular, actually. And there's also polling from Data for Progress that shows this as well. So I think that the Democratic Party has been running quite scared from a winning issue for a long time. And you even see this with Al Gore when he ran for president back in 2000. He had written a whole book about climate change in the 80s. This man is kind of the original climate champion. And yet he, when he was running for president, didn't really talk about it very much. I think that Democratic campaign consultants, or whoever they are, the powers that be, have had a message that this is not a top voting issue, or it's not what people care about. And we now know in poll after poll of Democratic primary members, as well as the general population, that this is actually a winning issue and that people are ranking this as a huge problem. So, it's been a long time coming, but the tireless work of journalists and academics, climate scientists, activists, Sunrise Movement, most recently, it's finally starting to break through. And I think that everyday Americans understand that this crisis is real, that it's happening now, and that they will have serious costs in their own backyard, whether that's hurricanes, fires, flooding, that climate change is coming for them. And so I am hopeful that the positive framing of the Green New Deal will actually be quite a winning recipe during the general election.
Well, Leah, you've been very helpful in going over these plans. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll have to have you on soon.
Oh, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on. And I would just encourage people to read the plans themselves, to get involved. That's really what we're all up to right now, trying to keep the heat on the candidates so that we can have the best climate policy possible in the future.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends while you're at it. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Julie Grant helped produce this episode. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.